Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. The global financial crisis and the rise of digital media have forced advertisers to reevaluate the way they build brands and interact with their customers. But China's size, growth, and chaotic media market make it difficult for advertisers to anticipate new customer demands. Today, our experts will look at how to energize your brand in China. And our own PT Black will have a thought or two on how some of China's own local leading brands have led the way. But first, we'll speak with John Gerzema, best-selling author and planner at Y&R. John, you believe that virtues like thrift and hard work are back in fashion. Is this a trend that only applies to the US, or do you see it in emerging markets as well?
I think it's a big global trend. I mean, one of the things that we saw were that people were actually supporting brands that reinforced their values, things like self-reliance, community, hard work, empathy. These have become more important sort of underpinnings for the reasons why we buy brands today.
And did you see these types of trends before the rise of companies like Groupon and things like that, or did they go hand in hand?
They kind of went hand in hand, and a lot of these values, when we use the word values, it sounds sort of conservative versus liberal. It was really things that were about common sense, right? So self-reliance, community, authenticity, trust, those were really important things. And we actually interviewed Andrew Mason for the book before Google offered him $6 billion for his business.
Right.
But I mean, these brands that are starting to emerge in this framework are really interesting, and a lot of them have a lot of resonance. I'll give you an example. There's a company called Blue Homes. Now, prefabricated housing has this sort of stigma attached to it that it's low quality. And the interesting thing about Blue Homes is that you build your house on the internet. So you go into bluehomes.com, you basically pick out your house, and it avoids all this expensive cost at the construction site. So what happens is they have this unique hinge design that folds like origami. So basically the house ships by rail or freight. All you need is water and energy and have a hookup, and basically you have this house that goes up in 3 days.
But I mean, that's different than buying a pair of shoes online. When you're buying your home, you have to really trust the brand that you're buying from. And that leads to my next question, because I know one of the observations you've made is that in Western markets, there's a big preference towards local brands currently. But in China, a lot of the local brands have been hurt by scandals, quality, health. A lot of these are very serious issues. So how do you think that consumers today in China are looking at local brands versus international brands?
Well, I think it's interesting. When we look at our data in Brand Asset Evaluator, one of the things we're seeing is that Chinese millennials are very similar to a lot of other millennials around the world. And part of that is driven by the fact that they're looking for brands that have authenticity, that sort of have integrity. And a lot of that is found in sort of the local narrative. What we found in our data was that people, while they're still really into national sort of name brands, they were more interested in things that were local because they had artisanal qualities. They had sort of a sense that you could curate your consumption, whether it was your shoes or whether it was buying beef down the street or whatever it was all about things that were local. If you were giving back to your community and doing things locally, it had a sense of sort of provenance. And that was what we did when we did the research for the book. We spent actually an entire period of time in Brooklyn, try to find a national brand in Brooklyn. Everything is, Brooklyn Industries, Marlowe and Sons, everything has sort of a local thing. And the coolest, probably most hip thing with millennials now is called the Brooklyn Flea, which is this flea market of all local brands. So just interesting dynamics. And I think on the side of the Chinese standpoint, it's reframing local away from low quality to things that are about sort of more of these authentic measures.
Are there any Chinese brands right now that are operating overseas that you see making an impact in Western markets?
Yeah, I mean, clearly they've become much more of a staple. There's greater awareness, brands like Haier, clearly Baidu, and what it's done to sort of overcome Google, for example. I mean, there's definitely a lot of excitement in this marketplace. But I actually think the more exciting thing is the number of brands that we don't know about that are here. And as these start to roll out, the excitement that they can come into the marketplace and sort of take on existing categories and really challenge them.
Right, it's going to be interesting to see now that Shenzhen has gone public in China, when Facebook comes in, if they do come in, how that's going to change that competitive landscape.
Absolutely, and social media isn't limited to Facebook. I mean, you look all around the world, not only that brand, but all the brands that exist. There's a tremendous amount of really interesting sort of global social media brands that aren't based in California.
Do you feel like with the rush of all the social media and the trends that you're seeing in those areas, do you sometimes have to calm your clients down and say, listen, you don't necessarily need a Twitter page, or everyone's jumping on in China, it's Weibo. Does everybody need all of these social tools?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about Trevor is don't think about the idea, the gadget, social media or social marketing, all those buzzwords. Actually think about your company as social as business model. So one of the companies we interviewed for the book, very big company in the US called Ford, Scott Monty is head of social media there, and he created a program called the Ford Fiesta movement. And what he did is he wanted to have people test drive the car. And what he discovered is when they were test driving it, largely millennials complained about the cup holders. And the reason was they were taking fast turns and their Red Bulls were flying out of the cup holders that were designed for sort of Cokes and Pepsis. And his point about it was, you know what, he got R&D and engineering involved and they made a real-time solution. So it's really about social as business model, not necessarily putting up a Facebook page or a Twitter page or a Weibo page. It's like basically making commitments that you're going to be social to your customer.
What do you think about the possibilities of China ever having a luxury brand like a Chinese LV?
Oh, I think it's absolutely possible. I mean, this is a huge luxury market. There's tremendous opportunity for craftsmanship, for creating amazing brands all over the world. And I think so much of the luxury dominance has been sort of trapped in sort of 3 countries, and it needs to really be opened up and expanded. And that's really what this time is about today.
And do you think, foreign consumers, foreign as in foreign to the Chinese, US, Europe, would ever accept a Chinese luxury brand?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you just look at provenance and where things come from, I think we have a growing appetite and interest in all types of brands. I think part of the idea and excitement is just getting those brands out in the marketplace so that people can really grab a hold of them and understand what they're all about.
Do you see any ways that China could potentially be stronger or bring some lessons to the West?
Oh, absolutely, in so many different ways. I mean, the sense of optimism right now and the sort of endless possibilities is something that's, I think, hugely infectious and inspiring to people in the West. I mean, we've gone through this period of sort of up and down, uncertain economy. Consumer confidence has been sort of back and forth, and so I think that the confidence and the excitement that you feel just being in Shanghai is something that is clearly needed in the more developed markets.
Right, and can you think of an example or give us an example where a brand that was maybe seen as stodgy and perhaps a little bit traditional energized themselves, and perhaps there's some lessons there that Chinese brands could learn from?
Yeah, sure, Trevor. I mean, I think one of the really interesting companies in the US right now is Walmart. So in our data 3 years ago, they were really struggling because they were seen as having unfair labor practices and a lot of sort of stigma attached to the brand. But they did a bunch of tactics that were really interesting. They did local food sourcing, which was to basically use the communities around their stores, the farmers, as sort of produce driven rather than having everything shipped. The other thing they did was green labeling. And then we interviewed the head of social media also at Walmart for a program called 11 Moms. 11 Moms is a network of mommy bloggers. And if you search the term mommy blogger, you see 20 million hits. What they wanted to do was they wanted to really get close to the customer. So these 11 Moms are like an outside advisory board for Walmart. Interesting, in our data, we've seen Walmart really move. So it's really less about making lots of changes as much as finding a few really key things that you can do to change your way that you do business.
Right. And are there any lessons that you hear coming out of China that when you're in the West that you kind of think, hey, it catches your attention and it's something that the West can learn from?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think obviously because of the global financial crisis in the US and in Europe, we've seen a lot of sort of malaise. One of the things we are seeing, though, is people persevering and sort of creating new businesses. We have the largest numbers of startups in the US right now since sort of 2000. So people are back into the market. But as we look at China, it's like unbelievably exciting. And I think that the optimism here and the sense of sort of, no fences, boundaryless sort of spirit and energy is something that the world really needs.
Well, do you see any Chinese brands right now that have the potential to become global brands?
Yeah, a ton. I mean, I think there are already. I mean, you look at Haier, you look at the potential for Baidu. I think, your Twitter clearly is a really interesting brand. Chery in the automobile space. Li Ning, this whole idea of inner strength. I think is a really interesting idea that could tap into the global marketplace, maybe take on Nike with an entirely different sort of, contemporary expression of what athletic achievement is all about.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Chery because obviously it's been a very controversial brand overseas ever since they started making announcements about the brand.
Yeah.
And then now, of course, it's plans to be selling vehicles and even SUVs in the US. Do you see some potential for a bit of protectionism from the US side to block brands like this from really developing and expanding, because the auto market is so important for the US brands?
Yeah, I mean, I hope not. And I think one of the key things, regardless of all the politics that exist in trade, is really about, do you have great ideas and do you have a great product? And I think in the case of like Hyundai, they came into the US during a dismal auto market and they grew about 12% on this idea of this buyer's reassurance program. You know, you American job worker, you lose your job and you can return the car. They hit on a huge thing, which was kindness and empathy and marketing about sort of actions, not just words.
Yeah, so and they had the 10-year warranties,
totally.
They had the huge bumper to bumper.
Yeah. Very cool stuff. So, you know, whatever Chery does, or any other brand for that matter, they have to have great ideas.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, John.
Thanks, Trevor.